talking earlier about places having a sense of presence.
Sense of what?
Presence.
Yeah.
Or whatever. And yet, if we, on another level, if we say that there's just one taste, which is just a radiance of energy, there still is a kind of, in addition to that, or in keeping with that, there does also seem to be a sense of acknowledgement or recognition or experience of a kind of awe or awesomeness.
You mean associated with places?
Well, with sometimes with play. I mean, it could be anything that inspires that. It could be something beautiful or artistic or a place that evokes a sense of something other or something.
Sure. There's all different confluences of qualities, and certain confluences of qualities seem to come together in a resonant way, or in a way which is evocative or powerful. Going to a well-performed symphony is a different energetic experience, perhaps, than tracing along behind a garbage truck when the men are picking up garbage in the morning, or maybe not. But the point being that there's all different qualities that present themselves within radiance, and certain of those qualities may be more evocative in various ways than others, but that's not absolute so much as it is. Well, let me put it this way: the degree to which you don't notice what this is the degree to which having evocative energies in your experience is of benefit. When you recognize what this is, you no longer need anything like that, because everything is a symphony. But when you are presented with an energy pattern that is evocative, that evokes noticing, then that's powerful, and you can use that to your advantage, because it provokes or triggers noticing. But again, the trick is to notice what is being evoked, and don't blame it on the situation that's evoking it and think that's what's special. In other words, the only thing that matters, the only thing that is powerful, the only thing that is ultimately fulfilling is this itself intrinsically, which is always the case, never more, never less. It's completely independent of situations. But having said that, certain situations may, in terms of your karma, bring the nature of this more to the forefront, and then you can take advantage of that fact. But it's provisional. It's just an aid. It's like training wheels or something. It's not valuable in itself.
In those situations where it's really nothing in particular that evokes that, I find that, especially when I feel nothing is happening, that kind of triggers remembering that, well, this is, and then that in itself starts with a thought, but that thought evokes the isness of that anything is.
Yeah, sure. Anything can be a jumping off point to reality, because everything and anything exists in the context of and consists of nothing but reality. So again, it comes down to this very strange and ultimately inscrutable relationship between noticing and not noticing, between having this be what it is and being able to see that, or not being able to see that, and what that is mysterious. But in practical terms, as a yogi, your challenge is to train yourself in being able to effectively notice, being able to free yourself or extricate yourself from not noticing, from obscuration, from well, again, it's ultimately mysterious and inscrutable and can't be defined. But as a matter of practice, that's irrelevant. So you find what works and take advantage of it. And anything can work.
Oh, that's interesting. That you're actually training yourself to not forget.
Well, not to not forget, because it's not like you need to remember. It's important. That's an important distinction. You don't need to remember. You just need to You need to notice.
Well,
it's not something. Remembering implies it's something you need to hold and maintain and cling to, and that's not the case at all. It's on the contrary. It's something you actually learn to. You're learning to let go of thinking anything matters. You're learning to let go of thinking that anything is different, or is in any way sub beneath anything else. You're letting go of devaluing. I mean, what keeps us from...
Of devaluing?
Yeah, what keeps us from appreciating this is that we devalue it. We think, oh, this is just normal. This is just a boring sitting around the living room. It's, God, I want something better than that. But you have to more or less actively, I mean, not deliberately, of course, karmically, you have to supply that devaluation. Because what this is inconceivable transcendence intrinsically, nothing but that. And so... you have to the training in yoga, a good way to put it, is you're learning how to stop devaluing, and so that's not the same thing at all as remembering.
Well, the opposite of to notice everything, is it an opposite of not noticing?
I'm sorry.
The art of noticing,
right,
is not the opposite of not noticing.
No, it's not an opposite, but the relationship, again, is mysterious. And so it becomes a matter, the theory of that is dizzying and irrelevant. So the practice is all that matters.
Right.
So the yoga of noticing is what matters, rather than the fact that noticing and not noticing are essentially the same thing and yet entirely different. Which, is dizzying, and you can't really sort it out. It's like it's basically trying to sort out Maya. How can you make sense of it? You can't make sense of it because it intrinsically doesn't make sense. That's why it's Maya.
I find that there's a very distinctive feeling tone that comes with noticing.
Certainly.
As opposed to a kind of drive that is contingent with the drive of the person.
Certainly, yeah. Yeah, because not noticing consists of thinking something is important, thinking there's some urgency that demands addressing in some sense. And of course, in reality, that's not the case. And so in noticing, you see that's not the case, and so you're freed of that entanglement, you're freed of that obsessiveness. Because it turns out that the very nature of this event is it's entirely self-sufficient. It's doing itself comprehensively, inclusively. And the idea that it's not, again, you have to devalue this. You have to say, oh, this is incompetent. Reality is incompetent to be itself. I have to cross the T's and dot the I's. I have to rise to the occasion and do what needs doing, because if I don't, it's not going to get done. And this kind of arrogance and ignorance is just giving ourselves endless trouble for no reason whatsoever, because it's just not the case. It's not the way this actually is.
But when we have actually apparently taken care of things, there is a sense of well-being and ease that
Certainly.
happens too.
Sure.
Which is sort of not the opposite of the other thing, but it does have like German said, a certain tone to it, that there is a kind of a free space or...
Sure. Yeah, having a sense that nothing needs to be done, that things have been taken care of is very liberating. But the truth is that is always 100% the case, which is what true liberation consists of.
Well, I think I'm noticing that more, that actually that feeling has nothing to do with whether things get done or not.
Exactly.
But, I've associated them previously
Yeah.
with getting things done.
Yeah. It's the sense that there's nothing remaining to be done.
Right. There's just a sort of an open feel.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and that is always ultimately intrinsically the case. And so when you see the nature of this, then that becomes clearly obvious. And then that feeling is just the constant feeling of, oh, how nice.
In fact,
everything's done, everything's taken care of.
Just being able to get the flavor of that experience periodically is helpful. Mm-hmm. Not as a result of having done anything, but just to get a familiarity with
absolutely.
that, sort of expansiveness or...
Sure. Any sense of fulfillment, any sense of ease in any context is the actual fulfillment and the actual ease. If it's impermanent, though, or if it seems to be dependent upon conditions, that's due to confusion, that's due to your misinterpreting it. But any sense of fulfillment or ease is the actual condition of reality itself. And anytime anyone feels that to any degree, they're feeling the condition of reality. But the fallacy is that you need to do something or accomplish something or function in a certain way in order to get to that. Whereas the truth is, all you have to do is understand clearly what this is, and you see that is always the case and cannot not be the case, and then that becomes just the constant flavor of being itself.
In fact, I find lately that it's helpful if things appear to be not going well or difficult to look around and actually examine what's going on and to find that experience of openness is there.
Yeah.
Then,
Yeah, this is noticing. I mean, noticing is discovering what is true regardless of circumstances. So you can be in a circumstance that's seemingly pushing your buttons and pulling your strings and demanding and so on and so forth. And yet, if you look at what's actually happening, you can find, but there's an okayness here, there's a self-sufficiency here, there's a fullness, there's a completeness, there's no urgency, because that is intrinsically the case. It's always the case, and since it is always the case, it is seeable and knowable that is the case. And when you do so, you get, this is the very nature of noticing, you get that, the fullness of reality is not dependent upon circumstances. It's not dependent upon condition. It's not like, when this gets accomplished, then everything will be all right. Everything's all right from the get-go. The ground condition, the starting condition is everything's all right, and then an event happens in the context of everything's all right, And after an event has happened, the result of the event, so to speak, to the extent there is one, remains everything's all right. So everything's all right is the beginning, everything's all right is in the middle, and everything's all right is at the end. So, and again, since that is actually the case, it's noticeable that that's the case. It's discoverable that that's the case, and this is the nature of noticing. And this, the fullness, the nature of what this is, the nature of what you are, is not dependent upon circumstances. It's not dependent upon action. It's not dependent upon things needing to be a certain way. There's no okayness that is achievable. Okayness is the intrinsic condition. And again, since that is intrinsically the case, it is noticeable, it is discoverable, it can be seen with certainty.
I think there was a Beatles song, something along those lines.
Probably a few, yeah.
Sounds familiar.
Just keeps ringing a bell.
Yeah, well, they were major prophets, in every sense of the word. You know, what we were talking about earlier is a very important point. We create the problems. We create a sense of insufficiency. We create a sense of incompleteness. We create a sense of lack. We create a sense of separation. We create all our problems in our imagination, and then based on those imagined problems, we try to strategize activities that may provide solutions or move towards solutions. But the solution to the problems isn't to solve them, so the solution to the problems is to see that they're non-existent. They only exist because we define them into existence erroneously in our imagination, and the conditions upon which they are based don't actually exist, because the actual condition is one of completeness, inclusiveness, absolute transcendence, absolute fullness and wholeness, and so on and so forth. So simply, since that is already the base condition, is already the intrinsic condition, all you need to do is see that. You don't need to get to that or create that or strategize to it or affect some course of action, because you don't need to do something to get to your starting point. You never left the starting point. All you need to do is see it and discover that you never left it. All you only imagined you have. So again, another way to put it is that we supply devaluation. We start with this condition of inconceivable transcendence, and we devalue it. We turn it into lesser. We turn it into partiality. We turn it into limitation. We turn it into, problems and challenges in our imagination, and then we somehow come to believe that we actually inhabit that condition, and we've cut ourselves off from the intrinsic fullness. But solely in our imagination. There's never been an actual departure from fullness. And since that's the case, you don't need to do anything to get to fullness, because you never left fullness. You just need to notice that fact, that you never left it. And the easiest way to do that is to notice what this is. Because it never stopped being that. It never stopped being fullness. It never stopped being transcendence.
Yet there is an inherent quality to transcendence.
Oh, absolutely. You know, it has all qualities are of it.
Yes.
And it/they are very specific.
Well, yeah, in as much, yeah.
I mean, it's not vague. It's exactly what it is.
Right, but it is everything.
Yeah, which happens to be everything. Happens to be transcendent. Happens to be all these other things we can impute about it, but it's not vague. On the contrary, it is actually something.
Yeah.
It is actually exactly the way it is. It's an actuality. Which again is our good fortune, because since it is an actuality, that makes it accessible, because it's this actuality right here. So it's so it is accessible, it is addressable, it is investigatable, and so it's self-verifying. So all you have to do is look into it, and you will see what it is, because it is what it is. It is an actuality. It is the way that it is, so to speak. And even though that way cannot be pinned down or tied down, or turns out to be transcendental, in the sense of being essentially and intrinsically unlimited, that doesn't mean it's not a specific actuality. But the way that it is very strange and nonlinear if you try and approach it in human terms, if you try and approach it in logical terms, which is one of the reasons why it can be challenging to approach if you're doing it from within a human brainwashed educational framework.
But even if you take it from that human perspective, which is inherently limited, that's still it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's why this is ultimately so easy, because because this actuality is actual, is right here, is accessible, is self-verifying, and so on and so forth. Oh, what a treat! Hello, welcome.
What's interesting to notice, Peter, that when something seems complete, that sometimes things happen and then there's a sense that something is more complete, when in fact it's no more complete than it was in reality, and yet there is an experience energetically of there being something added to.
Yeah. Well, we're in the habit of relating to our experience circumstantially. And so it can seem that a change in quality is somehow an improvement or a resolution or a greater completeness or a condition of greater fullness. But that's erroneous. Because qualities continually cascade into each other, and even though there's always difference, there is never improvement or diminishment. There's never stability. There's never a gain of anything, or for that matter, a loss of anything.
Right. Yeah, I'm actually seeing that everything is complete in and of itself, and it's just our need to connect things one to the other.
Yeah.
That we,
Yeah, because we're in the habit of relating to our experience circumstantially. We're in the habit of relating it in terms of events, in terms of circumstances, in terms of how we define and interpret what's going on in various ways. And all of that defining is essentially inaccurate.
right. Or the comparing,
Yeah,
you know, this thing over here versus this thing.
yeah. But the comparing is based fundamentally on defining, because you have to think you know what this is, and you have to think you know what that is to some extent to even compare them. And in actuality, things are not definable, so you can't know precisely what anything is. So in reality, comparing is impossible.
I've been thinking about that be normal that we were talking about before. Actually, what be normal is saying is be who you are.
Yeah, I think the sentiment is good, but I think it's not a very precise way to put it. I would put it that what is intrinsically the case is the only thing that matters. So you don't need to do or create or enact anything extra to get anything, because it's fruitless. There's no need for it. So be normal means be what you are, because that's already fine, which includes all of your normal functioning, of course. So it doesn't mean to be inactive, but to not expect that you're going to get anything, not expect that any kind of posturing or, trying to do anything is actually going to be any kind of a gain, or for that matter, a loss.
But for some people, posturing in one way or another is their normality.
Yeah, sure.
It's just
But again,
hope to achieve
yeah.
from it.
Yeah, I mean the word, the word, and I use it a lot, so you probably can imagine that's the case for me. The word that I would say is useful in that regard is the word intrinsic. It's because it's the intrinsic nature of things, it's the intrinsic quality of things that are important and valuable. And since they're intrinsic, they're already the case. They don't need to be enacted or achieved or gotten to or developed. There's a wonderful Sanskrit word which I use occasionally, but it's being a kind of a Sanskrit technical term. There's not much point, but it's a word that I resonate with most powerfully, and it's sahaja, which means spontaneous or natural. And it embodies this quality of inclusive or inherent. Especially in terms of functioning. What is powerful, what is intrinsically powerful and valuable for anyone is what they are, not what they do. And what they are will naturally express itself the way that it does. And that is primally and ultimately powerful and meaningful. So you don't need to aspire to be different or to make anything different, but to just let what is be what is, and that is entirely sufficient. a funny conversation tonight.
The Dzogchen teachers, certainly in the direct lineage, are always talking about the natural state and the nature of mind. And nature comes out a lot in their in the translation. Nature this, nature that,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes it sounds like there's several different kinds of nature, but I suspect there's only one nature that they're talking about. Whether it's nature of bone or nature of mind, or whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in Dzogchen there's technical terms. The nature of mind refers to, because they differentiate between Sem is the Tibetan word for thinking mind, or what a Westerner would mean by mind, and Semni, which is generally translated nature of mind or essence of mind, is what the mind isn't. What might be translated as consciousness better. So it's what that is, sort of ontologically, as opposed to what it does or what we're interpreting it as being. So the nature of mind in Dzogchen means the root condition of this as consciousness. Like a Sanskrit word, probably the same would be chit. And the natural state, again, is another sort of a technical idea they have, which is the ground condition, the ground state, that which is the primal condition within which everything occurs and from which everything develops spontaneously and to which everything resolves, which would probably be in Sanskrit analogous to Parabrahman or Paramashiva or something. And ultimately those are the same, of course. So, again, it's sort of they have these different technical terms to address the context, the philosophical context that the people who are approaching this might be educated in. But ultimately all these things converge, of course, because they're referring to this condition here, this actuality. Which in terms of Dzogchen and also in terms of what I talk about is simply this actuality that is the reality itself, which it turns out everything is, you are, all action is, all motivation is, all inception is, and all resolution is already intrinsically. So it never departs from itself. It doesn't gain anything or lose anything, and it does everything as your experience, as your life, as life. But it is fundamentally this one inclusive, functional condition or system, as opposed to all this fragmented parts and aspects that we may think of as interacting that need to be somehow brought into some kind of alignment or improvement, as in terms of the normal worldview that typically people have. So again, it comes down to seeing the inclusiveness of this, that this is actual. It's already, just see this as it is, and then you will notice that it does everything. It is the substance of everything. It is the motive of everything. It is the it is the functionality of everything, and it is the resolution of everything. So it's all done in-house. And wholeness is a really nice notion. Wholeness is can be a little confusing because it may imply a unity that is in some sense bounded or limited. And although this is whole, it is unlimited. It's whole in the sense that it doesn't depart from itself, and it includes itself absolutely, but it is intrinsically infinite and unlimited. And it's not gathered, shall we say.
I don't understand the logic or the reasoning in one little short saying. This is a summation of a whole lifetime. You know, he's passing this on as the essence of his life, and so you have to take it seriously. But I'm not quite sure that I understand the logic, and I want to read one sentence. There's only about 3 sentences here in his life summary. But he starts off with the nature of bodhicitta is a great bliss, period. It cannot be visualized as everything is absolutely as it is.
Mm-hmm.
Now he's saying because everything is absolutely as it is, you can't visualize it. Now I'm not sure. I can read that sentence several different ways, and I would just be curious.
Well, to visualize it, you essentially have to abstract it, and things cannot be abstracted because they're what they are. In other words, the only way to accurately abstract anything is it itself, which of course is not a visualization. It's not an abstraction. It's the event itself is its own completion, and is the only completeness that can be associated with the event is the event itself. But if you visualize it or abstract it, you're creating a partiality that is not it. In other words, this is unthinkable. So it is as it is itself, and you can't be with it any more fully than that. And anything other than it itself is not it. You're departing from it. You're going into an abstraction, which is not it. So then you are not visualizing it, you're visualizing something else and calling it it. Which is exactly what we do in our worldviews. I mean, this is the very nature of confusion. We look at this and we generate an idea of it in more or less subliminally, more or less, however we do it, and then we think that the idea is accurate, and that it cannot be. It cannot be for that very reason, that only this itself can be it, can represent it, can embody it. And as soon as you think about it, you're not thinking about it, you're thinking about something, some notion that you're calling it, but the it that you're calling it is not the it that it is. Like your idea of someone you know is not the person, self-evidently. No matter how sophisticated and elaborate it is, no matter how well you can have known someone all your life and very intimately, and still your idea of them will not be them. And as soon as you see them, it's completely obvious that that's the case. And it just likewise with this. This cannot be. This is as it is, and you can't get farther than that with regards to it.
So that's the very distinction between noticing and not.
Yeah, sure. I mean, noticing, a good way to describe, define noticing is to notice that this cannot be abstracted, and that this completely transcends your ideas of it, at which point you no longer give credence to your ideas of yourself and your life and your world, and you let go of all that, or whether or not you let go of it, it recedes in relevancy or actuality in favor of the actual actuality, which of course is this that is actual. We get mesmerized into thinking that our idea of something is somehow the thing, is somehow true, is somehow accurate to some degree. And of course the truth is it is wholly not. It is entirely not accurate. Our ideas and our concepts and our beliefs are intrinsically completely inaccurate, period. Because actuality cannot be thought. It cannot be captured in concept. Just because of its nature. And this is exactly what that sentence says in its circumlocution. But then, fortunately, this doesn't need to be captured because it's right here. You have it. You have direct access. You don't need to capture it. You don't need to abstract it. You don't need to make sense of it or have an idea of it because you have the thing itself. You are the thing itself. And so then this kind of schizophrenic living on two planes once, where we're living in our ideas of things and then coming up against the real world, stops, and it's just reality. It's just the real world, and it does itself. So which of course is much easier. And you're freed of the obligation to make sense of things, or keep juggling your ideas and your worldview and your plans and all those things.
Peter, there's a question here. This person is asking, do you believe that some people are more attuned to perceive reality?
No, not per se. Everyone's always perceiving reality. I would say that everyone has the opportunity to completely understand reality always, every instant. But people have different facility to take advantage of that due to luck, due to their nature, due to circumstances, etc., etc. What you might sum up under karma. But none of that can be foretold or predicted. In other words, someone with enormous obstacles and lack of facility can still assimilate reality clearly because it's always available to be assimilated. But they may or may not do so.
He says thank you.
I mean, another way to put it is it's very easy to perceive reality. It can be difficult to let go of unreality. And the qualities that it takes to do so are unpredictable. Giving up unreality is probably a lot like an alcoholic giving up drinking. At any time, any alcoholic can do so, but they may or may not. And the qualities that enable that or that affect that are not necessarily predictable or understandable. It's like we were talking about earlier. You know, we actively supply a devaluation to our experience. And finding reality is not finding something, it's stop not finding it, stop devaluing it, stop saying this sucks, where's reality? This is reality. You know, if you stop saying it sucks and it's not reality, if you stop telling yourself that, then you can see reality. So it's very much a matter of, it's not a matter of finding something or seeing something so much as stop not seeing it, stop misidentifying it, stop devaluing it, stop saying it's something else, stop saying it's lesser and partial and frustrating and limited when it in actuality is none of those things. There's another analogy with alcoholics. Any moment an alcoholic doesn't actually have a drink in his hand, lifting to his lips and drinking from it, he's given up drinking. As soon as you put down the drink to light a cigarette, you're not drinking. It's you that goes back and picks up the drink again and takes a drink. So it's something that is reinstated actively in real time. And likewise, ignorance is the same thing. Ignorance has to be actively reinstated, recreated in the moment. It's not something that you're somehow stuck in. You have to do it. And any moment that you're not doing it, you're not in ignorance. And ignorance simply consists of interpreting your experience. Any moment you're not interpreting your experience, you're not in ignorance. And as soon as you go back to interpreting, it's like the alcoholic reaching for his drink. And in between interpretations, when you're in a condition of non-interpretation, fuzziness or whatever, sleep, whatever it is, you're not in ignorance.
I had actually said that to my brother when I saw him recently, because I heard he'd given up smoking and he was smoking. And he said, well, I haven't been smoking most of the time, except when I do.
Sure. I've given up smoking except when I have this lit cigarette in my hand that I'm inhaling. Sure, of course. Yeah, ignorance is not some cosmic condition that has some persistence that we're somehow lost in.
Yeah.
It's an activity that's done in real time. At the difference between realization and bondage happens right now, always. It has no momentum. Other than the momentum we give it by keep going back to it, by recreating it. It's like the alcoholic, keeps picking up the drink. Stop drinking's easy, just don't pick up a drink. You may or may not feel like crap, but that has nothing to do with it. Just don't pick up the drink, you won't be drinking. And you can be not drinking for years and you can pick up a drink and all of a sudden you're drinking. It's that simple because it's in real time. And ignorance is the same thing. As soon as you start interpreting your experience, you're in ignorance, and it's something that you do right now. It's not something you're stuck in, or that has like a cloud that somehow, or a swamp you're lost in that you have to find your way out of. It's just a simple activity. It's a behavior that happens in real time. And it's a partial behavior. It's a behavior that happens in the context of not itself. So interpreting happens in a context of uninterpretation. So here you are not interpreting, and all of a sudden you interpret, but that interpreting happens in the context of not interpreting. So you aren't actually cut off from non-interpretation. You just happen to be interpreting at that moment.
Well, I would go ahead and interpret that.
here's another question. Would you ask Peter if he could talk about death, just his thoughts, etc.?
Well, death isn't particularly interesting because it's a fantasy. You know, sitting in life, talking about or thinking about death, you're not thinking about death, you're thinking about your idea of death or your fantasy of death. It's much more interesting to look at what's happening right here, right now, which is not a fantasy. And if you see what that is, you will see what death is. Because when death comes, it will be what's right here, right now, which will not be fundamentally different than what's always right here, right now. But anyway, fundamentally, looking at death is just looking at your fantasy of death, your idea of death, your story about death. Only a dead person knows what death is. And soon enough you'll be that. But now you may define yourself as a live person, and so you have access to that actuality. That's not a fantasy. So I would recommend looking at what that is. Because the only response you can have to fantasy is more fantasy.
Sounds like a pretty serious double bind. Because I may realize that fantasy is the problem, and I may then respond to that by trying not to fantasize, and that's the response.
Yeah, but fantasy is not a problem, and not fantasizing would not be a solution. Thinking that fantasy is actuality other than fantasy is the problem. Fantasizing is not a problem. Thinking that fantasy is not fantasy is a problem.
Thinking that fantasy is not fantasy.
Yeah, fantasy is fantasy. There's nothing wrong with fantasy, but fantasy is actual, but fantasy is actual fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
So the fantasy of death is a delightful actuality as a fantasy.
Right.
But if you think your fantasy of death is actuality, is actual death, then you're a crazy person. I mean, insanity could be defined as thinking something is objectively true that is only existing in your mind. Mm-hmm. If I thought I was Napoleon or something, you might say, God, this guy's whacked. But if I have the fantasy that I'm Napoleon, then I'm just a guy having a fantasy. And if I'm not believing it, I'm not crazy. Having the fantasy doesn't make me crazy. Believing the fantasy is objectively true and not seeing that it is a fantasy makes me crazy. So fantasy is not the problem. Not seeing that fantasy is the problem. Because a fantasy is as actual. It's actual fantasy. A dream is an actual dream. But it's a dream. Ignorance consists of confusing the two. Thinking our thoughts actually are reality, refer to reality. Thoughts are real thought. Vision is real vision. Thought has nothing to do with vision except that they coexist. But when I think that I'm thinking something and it has something to do with something I'm seeing, then I'm a crazy person. So seeing your experience in real time as it is thought, vision is vision, fantasy is fantasy, sound is sound, and so on and so forth, is being with actuality. And it doesn't need to not be any way that it happens to be. If you're fantasizing, that's fine. You know, fantasy can be great fun. It's a fabulous, it's a wonderful venue of, or medium or bandwidth of experience. But it has nothing to do with anything other than itself, what it is intrinsically.
It is, for me, difficult to tell the difference between a fantasy and a belief. Because a fantasy seems, if you interpret a fantasy, that's actually a belief, right?
Right. If you think something a fantasy is, anything you think is objectively true is a belief. So I can have a fantasy about Mickey Mouse dancing on Dumbo's back, and it's a fantasy. But if I think Mickey Mouse is dancing on Dumbo's back just outside this window, and then I look and I see it's not the case, then, well, in that first case it's a belief, and in the second case it's an erroneous belief.
So I guess you're a crazy person.
Right. Right. So in other words, believing your fantasies are objectively true is belief and defines insanity for me, and is the mechanism of spiritual bondage, spiritual confusion, and all spiritual problems.
So then, if I have a fantasy that of anything, then it just stops there. It's not actually believing that it's happening.
Right. Then that's fine. That's not entrapping. It's just a fantasy. You know, and the most insidious way that we do this is with our interpretations of what the world is or what we are. For example, one of the most commonplace fantasies is that, you know, my body exists in space and time. I am my body. I am in my body. I am not outside my body. Everything outside my body in space and time is not me. Now, these kinds of... So that's a fantasy. That's an idea. But if I hold that to be objectively true, that creates a feeling tone of my relationship with my experience, which has various implications, which are very demanding, right? And it turns out that all of that is just a hypothesis. You know, that is a fantasy, that's an idea, that's a possibility, but there's no way to arrive that is in fact the truth, because other interpretations are just as viable. But if I subliminally just hold that to be true, then that warps my life, dominates my approach to my experience. I suppose I think that any human being whose skin tone is drastically different than mine is weird or malevolent or subservient or whatever, then that's going to warp my behavior with my experience again. I mean, any sort of belief that anything that I fantasize is objectively true binds me by subtly brainwashing me, let's say, or hypnotizing me to relate to my experience in a stilted and warped way, in an unfluid and unspontaneous way. You know, and this is the problem with all these worldviews, is typically as human beings who have been raised ignorantly just by the cultural norms and so on, we have been, programmed more or less to, just to hold various worldviews and ideas about what things are intrinsically as if they're objectively true, and as if there's no question that that's just the case. And we are bound, we are stymied, we are warped by these things we hold to be true, that actually, in actuality, they exist nowhere but in our imagination. But if you don't notice that, if you think that these things aren't just in my imagination, they're objectively true, then you're a crazy person. It's like a person who thinks everyone's out to get them. Well, it's a hypothesis. Maybe they are. Maybe everyone is out to get you. But, probably not. And so if you think that and you act in a way that's constrained by that belief, then you're warped. You're stymied. You're a rat running in a maze that doesn't actually exist in the real world. But you feel constrained by that, by your own self-supplied condition that exists in actuality nowhere but in your imagination. So that's why differentiating between imagination and actuality is so powerful. And having these hypotheses is fine. Maybe everyone is out to get you, and it's an interesting worldview to look at. It's an interesting hypothesis to explore. But it's very different to explore it as a hypothesis as opposed to thinking that it is actually true undeniably. See what I mean? It's a very different way of being with your experience. Why don't we have a little break and refresh our chai and such, and be back in a little while, 5 or 10 minutes.
We brought cheesecake.
Nice. Oh my God, the cheesecake?
Well,
there's a sentence in this book that I wanted to ask your help with for a while, and I may as well take this opportunity if I may. And again, it's very short. A short statement. The sentences before that is explaining this natural state is not separate from our own nature of mind. Once you realize this nature, it neither shifts nor changes, neither increases nor decreases. Then, my question, my sentence, once this is realized by itself, that is great Dharmakaya.
Yeah.
What is the significance of by itself?
Twofold. On the one hand, the realization it realizes itself, and on the other hand, it is realized by itself, not in any context. In other words, it's the realization of it is alone, is unique. So it's by itself. It's not like realized in the context of anything else. And that is Dharmakaya, i.e. it's the ground condition, the natural condition, the subsuming basis of all that nothing departs from.
So it realizes itself,
Yeah,
and also there are no auxiliaries to the realization.
exactly. No auxiliaries, no context. It is its own context. It is the great uniqueness. And in realizing it, that becomes self-evident, that becomes apparent, that it is the uniqueness, that it is the inclusive actuality, the inclusive absolute. Until it's realized, you can't know that. You can hypothesize that, and you can theorize that, and you could even intuit that. But when it's realized, that becomes the undeniable, self-evident, self-verifying fact, the actuality. And it is absolutely, it is by itself in every sense of the phrase. It exists by itself. It exists in itself. It exists because of itself. It exists within itself as a medium, and it experiences itself. So the realization of itself is by itself. So it's a nice pun. It's the goal of yoga, because at that point subjectivity and objectivity are seen to be one and the same. In this actuality.
So when you become aware of what's really going on, there's a certainty that's associated with it that's different from identifying with a point of view. So
Yeah,
fair to say.
sure. It's the certainty of actuality. It's the certainty of objectivity. It's exactly the same certainty that we always and have always experienced of, the certainty of, what feels the truth of objectivity, like, that I am seeing, and so on and so forth, which is self-evidently, self-verifyingly true. The certainty there, which is not philosophical or theoretical. It is that same certainty because it is that same order of truth, of self-verifying nature. It's the objective fact And whereas identification is less certain. Identification is ultimately psychologically generated or mentally generated, whereas something like the existence of your vision in real time is not. It's not a theory, it's not an idea, it's a non-verbal, self-verifying presence. If I said that my field of vision was not present, it would be an absolute absurdity. I mean, I can say it all I want, but that doesn't change the fact that it obviously is. Mm-hmm. And that the objectivity of that isness is the order of certainty that realization consists of. And in fact, they're one and the same. Because, what this is simply the objective condition, the objective fact. It's not generated, it's not a notion, it's not an idea, it's not a theory, it's not a philosophy, it's just what is. And what isn't because you think it is because it is, whatever you think about it. And whatever you think doesn't actually change the event.
Is it a sort of an association with, or identification with the perceiving faculty that gives it that objectivity?
Well, it's not identification with it, it's seeing that the perceiving faculty is objectively true and is what you are. So, I mean, subjectivity and objectivity collapse into the same event rather than having any degree of sort of a different basis of assessment or something.
Subject-object being.
Yeah, because any kind of a subject-object dichotomy is created in imagination or conceptually, essentially, because of course the object is objectively being perceived, and the perceiving faculty, whatever it is and such as it is objectively perceiving the objectivity as one system. And we can sort of verbally say that, we have these two different things, so they're kind of two different ways of describing these poles, so they're two different things, but that's all just a bunch of sophistry. Mm-hmm. The fact is it's a coexistent system that's co-functional. If it has parts, the parts are all parts of this actuality that is, whatever it is.
And then that slippery stuff where there's a subjective point of view. For example, if you ever had for example, I've gone and I've apologized to somebody for something.
Uh-huh.
Saying, I'm sorry, I did such and such. And very often the person will say, well, you didn't do that. You did this instead. So you're talking about apples and oranges. And that's sort of a dramatic dramatization of what goes on all the time about, and even my own perception about what's going on. And in a certain way is variable depending upon mood, tiredness, did I just eat lunch, did I not eat lunch yet?
Yeah, but most of that order of interpretation is just that, interpretation, i.e. imaginary. Like all memory, like your idea of what you did is a story that you hold in your imagination, is not an event, it's a fiction. And the fiction may or may not have some degree of correlation with some kind of actuality that you think you experienced. But what another person's fiction about the same actuality, if it was the same actuality from their point of view, is first of all, their fiction is going to deviate from their actual experience in the first place, and it may well deviate from your experience and deviate even more from your fiction of your experience. So I mean, there's like many orders of remove in that kind of a transaction. The idea that memory has anything to do with event is very slippery and sloppy to begin with.
So these call them insights that can come along. They're part and parcel of the subjective rather than the objective. It's like, aha, now I understand. That's not really...
It may or may not be, because subjective isn't really subjective. In other words, it's slippery, because a subjective event is actually an objective event, because to the extent it exists as an experience, it's some kind of an energy functioning as experience. But what the event actually is and what you think it is where subjectivity splits off.
Yeah.
That the event is objective. What it is and what you hold it to be is subjective. Now, so-called revelations or seeings or whatever it seems to be, are actual and objective to the extent they are, and then what you think about it and interpret it and the importance you give it or lack thereof and so on and so forth, it may exist in interpretation, which is subjective and essentially a fantasy. So there's just sort of layers of the event rather than it being one thing.
But they're always subjective only in the present. As soon as you think about something that's happened, it's totally subjective.
As the event, it's subjective, but as the experience of fantasizing, it's objective.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
the simple fact is that, and the confusing fact is that nothing we think or interpret has anything to do with the event we think we're thinking about or we think we're interpreting. It's actually an abstraction into newness, into something else. It's like if I create a stick figure of you and say it has something to do with you, it actually has nothing whatsoever to do with you. It is its own entity, which is it's its own objective event, which is distinct and separate from the objective event that is you, say, in the same sense that this cup is. So thinking about something is not about it, it's generating something new, and then you're pretending it has some relationship to the thing, which is, very nonlinear at best, which we tend to ignore. I mean, what trips us up is we may not be clear on how removed our thinking and memory and interpretations and so on are from the actual objective events. And letting go of all that and settling into objectivity is what realization consists of, including the objectivity of interpretation, because interpretation is an objective event, but the interpretations are inaccurate.
So that you're somehow still having these subjective experiences and so forth, but you're also objectively perceiving it, or there's no more subjective experience. All of the experience is objective. Oh.
It's a collection, and for example, thought is an objective fact. That thought occurs in real time is, let's say, an objective fact. The subjectivity of thought, i.e., the storyline, the interpretations, the implications, does not exist as an actuality. It exists as thought, which is an actuality, and as an actuality, it's objective. It's not subjective. And so basically, it's the collapse of subjectivity. All genuinely existent subjectivity is found to be completely objective. In other words, it's a real-time actuality. And anything which seems subjective, interpretations and all that, don't exist as such. They exist as an objective, real-time energy event, let's say, or not at all.
And it's just a shift in perspective.
Yeah, shift in perspective. It's not a change of events at all. It's a seeing the what it is rather than holding it to be some way that it isn't. But it's not a change of the actual events at all. I mean, thought continues, fantasizing continues.
But are there these moments like picking up the drink when after the 20 years now you're drinking because you picked up a drink? And it seems like it would be very easy to identify with a thought or become subjective without retaining it.
There can be. It's not impossible. But there doesn't need to be, because when you see powerfully or clearly enough what this actually is, going to a misinterpretation of it is there's no plus side, there's no upside, there's no reason to do it.
Oh man.
And you don't need to do it because you get your cake and eat it. You can still have thoughts, you can still have fantasies, you can still have all that, but you don't take it as anything.
Yeah.
It's just what it's just you just are with it as it actually is, which is just a weird, intangible, ungraspable energy event, that we call experience. It's doing itself and occurring strangely and unanalyzably and undescribably, which is what everything has always been. No surprise there. So it's a condition of simplification without any loss of event or quality at all. So it includes all function prior to realization is exactly the same function that happens post-realization, but you're not taking it as this overblown, elaborated, important thing. It's just, it collapses to the level of all objective event, which is just this amazing light show, whatever, however you want to model it or describe it.
The whole objective-subjective dichotomy seems to be, when you get to those sort of complex areas of what is and what isn't, seems to be a bit of a red herring, because it seems to offer a solution to something that ultimately has no definition or solution.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I follow the way you're putting it, but it certainly is. I mean, it's interpreted into existence. There's no such thing in actuality.
That's right.
The actual condition is much simpler than that. We complicate it with these notions of subjectivity and objectivity, when everything is just an objective event, i.e. an experience. And experience is the only objective event. Seeing is an objectively true, self-evident event. The presence of thought is an objectively true, self-evident event, which happens in real time, spontaneously, exactly as seeing does, what we call seeing, for example. And everything, and there's nothing, you can't find anything that isn't essentially the similar kind of a condition. And so qualifying something as subjective and objective and all that is just complicating it baselessly, on sort of on the basis of theory which doesn't have a leg to stand on. I mean, it's just kind of bootstrapped into existence.
Well, my point was taking it actually one step further, which was interpreting that. Interpreting anything as either objective or subjective,
Right.
is subjective.
Yeah. And
consequently,
it is subjective, and it actually creates subjectivity, too.
and it creates subjectivity, absolutely. And so muddies the waters and actually leads to nowhere.
Yeah, it doesn't add anything. It just adds a non-existent complexity. A complexity that doesn't actually exist. It's baseless, that's it. because anything that's objective is actually subjective. What you see, no one else sees. You know, I mean, anything you can find that is objective is essentially subjective. It could be, and anything that is subjective is as objective as anything that you classify ordinarily as objective. You know, what you see is as much. It exists in the same order of being as what you think. They're just presences in your consciousness, and they're absolutely subjective in the sense that no one else is experiencing them. But they're absolutely objective in the sense that they are doing themselves, and they're undeniably present. They're not asserted. They're not argued. They're not arguable. They are de facto the case.
There's a quality of feels like being in one's experience, one cannot have the necessary breadth of context within which to understand what's subjective or not.
Right.
And to see it as objective.
Right.
It almost seems like you need to get out of that, and there's nowhere to go.
Well, you can't get out of that, so that becomes your touchstone of that is the condition. Whether since you can't tell whether it's subjective or objective, that's a meaningless and useless classification that just muddies the waters. Mm-hmm. So don't worry about whether it's objective or subjective. It's the only thing that is,
yeah.
And all experience is of the same order of actuality. So whether it's subjective or objective is absurd, because any yardstick you find is going to be in the same order of being. It won't be from outside, you know. It's like pinch me so I know if I'm dreaming. But you're in the dream, so if you pinch me, what does that prove, you know?
I suppose it's so that you'll wake up, right?
But how can I tell whether or not I just dreamed that I woke up?
Yeah, right.
You have to pinch me again. Doesn't prove anything, because it doesn't actually come from outside. There's no inside or outside, it's the bottom line. Mm-hmm. And everything exists on the same order of objectivity, or let's just say the same order of presence. And so this whole classification of subjective and objective is just murky as hell. It doesn't clarify anything. It just...
Well, I guess what I'm trying to get at is the sense of identification with some viewpoint, which is obviously variable. For example, in my case, depending on mood or tiredness or hunger or whatever, the same stimuli will create a different response in me.
Sure.
My perception will be totally different, and I'll be, that'll be true.
Sure.
And so I can hear that. Well, yeah, that's objectively the case, and
right.
That's your experience, and so what? On the other hand, it feels entrapping. It feels like what I know is changing, or it's
right. But again, but that's due to referencing things in terms of holding them to be various ways. So things can be this way, things can be that way. There are conditions that are knowable and definable, and you're preferring one to the other, or you're relating something to one or the other. And that's erroneous, because nothing can be known, certainly, as being anything in particular. So as soon as you hold anything to be anything in particular, you are fabricating that baselessly. Mm-hmm. Because experience is undefinable. You can't say what anything actually is, because it's, for various reasons, but primarily it's just too much information.
Yeah.
And too much instability, and too many different angles inclusive in any experience. So as soon as you are relating to anything as being a certain way, you're creating a fiction of it, because the actuality cannot be accurately defined that precisely.
Mm-hmm. But it's habitual.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a mode of referencing your experience to your experience as if it was definable, as if you had some idea what anything was, which is essentially a denial of the self-evident fact that you don't and you can't. And the remedy is to notice that you can't, and then that whole tendency just gets deflated. because it's like, what's going on here? Well, I don't really know.
Mm-hmm.
Do I like it? Do I not like it? Well, I don't really know. I kind of like little bits of it, and I kind of don't like little bits of it, I think, and I don't really know that. And so, I mean, so you enter a world of sort of cloudiness and murkiness where nothing is really sharply this or that, and is just an ebb and flow of constantly changing indefinabilities, and welcome to reality. And it's always been that. So it's very familiar, and we're actually very used to being in that mode because it's where we've always actually been. But it's not further clouded by all of these attempts to define it, which ultimately just inflict pain. They ultimately just, because again, they can generate senses of entrapment, senses of stuckness, senses of frustration, senses of limitation, senses of incompleteness, of which there's no basis for verifying in the indeterminacy of the actual experience. It's not that you're not lacking, it's that you can't know if you're lacking. Because things are too indefinable in actuality,
Yeah.
and so the empowering stance is to notice that.
And notice it despite a temperament that has a flair for the dramatic and wants things to be very black and white all the
Sure,
time.
because that itself is also fuzzy. So you don't need to not do that. Just know and see that in doing that, it's also indefinable. And that very tendency is indefinable, and what it actually does is indefinable. And even defining is ultimately indefinable. So you don't need to stop. I mean, it's very slippery and paradoxical. You don't need to actually stop doing it. You just need to see what it is, that it is ultimately itself indefinable and exists in a context of indefinability. So you kind of get there without needing to change anything. It's not like you need to stop doing something. Just see what it actually is, and then you can keep doing it as much as you ever have done it, but it stops being entrapping at that point, because it just becomes open-ended weirdness, as opposed to this difficult situation that you keep banging your head against.
Yeah. Well, it seems like the problem of your Napoleon example is believing that the thoughts or the feelings about the experience are accurate.
Yeah, exactly. Which is I've been calling that definability, or defining things or relating to your experience in terms of holding it to be certainly this or that. But that's the principle.
Yeah.
And the actuality of experiences is not really like that. Experience is very slippery. Experience is very dreamlike. It's very cloudy. It's very murky. In terms of getting a handle on exactly what anything is, or exactly what's happening in any situation, right? I mean, it's not that it's not happening. It's definitely happening. But what it is like, well, I don't know. It's pretty weird. It's got a lot of qualities, a lot of aspects, and more than that, and more than that. And so, we can sit and talk about it and think about it, but it's not like we're going to get to the bottom of it. So, what's happening here? Well, I don't know. What's going to happen? Well, I don't know. Where's it leading to? Well, I don't know. And that's very different. Things are like this, and I really hate it. I want them to be like that, and which is fabricated out of oversimplification, which is basically a denial of the actuality of indeterminacy, of undefinability, of the actuality of experience.
It seems to be the main game in town. You don't run into people saying, I don't know. People are telling you, no, this is the way it is.
Yeah. Well, that may be the main game in town, but it's not a game I recommend playing.
Yeah.
Just because most people are playing it doesn't mean you have to.
Yeah. I'm just talking about the magnitude of the issue.
Well, this is the challenge, is that we are conditioned, and specifically given our tribal inclination as humans to mimic the people around us. Everyone around us is behaving in a certain mode. It's difficult not to be seduced into mirroring that and to go into that mode yourself. And of course, we all have done exactly that in the course of our lives, in our childhood and all that. We got sucked into, trying to be a person as much as we may suck at it, or not. So there may be some functional people here. I don't know.
Talk about today, not in our childhood.
Yeah, right. But just because we have had a tendency to do so, and just because most people do so, it doesn't mean you have to. If you can find a way not to, which is kind of what we're selling here. You know, that possibility. Because the evidence for the alternative is immediately present and undeniable. And the evidence, the logical support, the justification for that mode of behavior is laughably absent and non-existent in the face of the actual condition of experience. So if you actually look at your experience, this absurdity of this arrogance and buffoonery of people trying to be somebody, you know, it's laughable, it's pathetic. You know, there's no basis for it, and the only basis for it is denial of the fact that there's no basis for it, which is, again, bootstrapped into existence just by asserting it to be so. Oh, that's ridiculous. I know what's what. I know who I am. I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, probably.
So you said that's not a game that you recommend playing. Do you have any games you recommend playing?
Well, any game, if you know it's a game. The problem with those games is if you forget they're a game and you think they're urgent or important, or that's when it starts being painful. You can play any game you want, and it's no issue whatsoever. But if you know it's a game, I mean, it's fun. I can go out and argue and duke it out with the best of them, but I'm laughing in my sleep because I know it's a big fucking joke.
It's difficult even in spiritual spiritual attempts to be spiritual. The same problems can occur. Basically thinking you know something, thinking, oh, now I understand something.
Yeah.
And another issue is that it's easy to focus on the problem rather than the quote unquote solution. And you can endlessly talk about what it isn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you know, I think it was before you arrived this evening. This was actually the start of our conversation tonight. We were talking about how we create all our problems by defining them into existence, and then having done so, if you think the solution to that problem is to find the solutions, you're a rat in a cage or a rat in a maze. The solution to that is to see that you've defined them into existence and they don't actually exist, and then you're free of them without needing to solve them or even address them. And it's the same kind of a paradigm here. You know, it's just it's not a matter of solving these problems. It's seeing they're not problems; they're fantasies, they're misinterpretations. So,
it's like Einstein's the problem can't be solved at the level we created it or whatever.
Sure. Yeah. But you know, it's fortunate the way it actually happens to turn out, because problems don't actually exist, so they don't even need to be solved. So you just short circuit the whole thing by just simply seeing that, noticing, and since that is actually the case, it is noticeable and discoverable and self-verifyingly obvious that is the case.
It's like pulling the plug on the movie projector.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nice analogy. So the solutions to all the problems of our lives and who we are and all that is to see that they don't exist, not to solve them, or to come up with strategies, or to come up with solutions, or to be looking out there for the magical keys which are going to fit in all these locks. Just drop the whole thing. Without even needing to drop it. Because when you see it's not a problem, doesn't mean you need to stop doing it. So it's kind of cake and eat it situation.
So then you just go, oh my God, someone pulled the plug. Let's plug it back in again.
Yeah, but at that point you know it's just a movie.
Yeah, right.
You know, and hey, everyone knows movies are great fun.
the emotional realm.
Mm-hmm.
Because, the thought realm is, thoughts are easily changeable. You can go, oh, okay, it's not real, great. Change my thought and it's over, it's done.
Mm-hmm.
But in the emotional realm, when your nervous system flares
Mm-hmm.
and, then, the story just comes in into
Mm-hmm.
play,
Mm-hmm.
and you need to go to bed for 2 days
Right.
because you can't face it or whatever the case may be.
Been there, done that.
And you can say what you just said to yourself, or somebody else can. They can say, it's not real.
Mm-hmm.
How does that even integrate at that moment? Because that's a thought.
Right.
It's not necessarily speaking anything to the nervous system at all.
Right. At that moment, your one real recourse is to go to the actual experience, go to the textural presence of the emotion itself, which if you do so, see, it's a complex situation, at least in terms of trying to deconstruct it like we're doing here, because the emotional reaction or meltdown or whatever you want to call it is generated by a belief system, a thought system, always. Now that doesn't do you much help when you're in the meltdown. So there's a two-pronged way of approaching that situation. When you're in the emotional situation, the only real powerful and easy solution is to be with the emotion as an actual experience, as a textural presence. In other words, just be, instead of holding it as an emotion at arm's length in the context of your story, which just feeds back on it and basically strengthens it. Such and such happened and they said this and they did this or I did this and blah, blah, blah. And you're sort of, nursing a grudge and feeding back on the emotion, sort of the whole thing just sort of keeps going. Here's the emotion, here's the experience of this, whatever it is, right? It will be a textural presence. It will be, there's something there. It is an actual experience. And as an experience, it has qualities. It has actual presence as actual energies. I mean, it has texture, let's say. It has flavor. It has, it has whatever. I mean, obviously you can't really be very precise in trying to, pin down what these qualities are, but it will have qualities as an energy presence, and by being with it by being with it structurally, be with the substance of what it is, you will be being with it in a different way than just being with it superficially in terms of the story that generated it. And that will tend to move towards a kind of an openness or a kind of a transcendence of the original storyline which essentially generated it. And then when you're not in the throes of it is a time to then when you're more free of real, sort of being frozen up around the thing, then you can play with the other side of the approach, which is to again notice your experience textually and notice that your ideas about things are simplistic, which will tend to, to the extent to which you succeed in seeing that, will tend to deflate your investment in your storylines, and your interpretations of things, which is ultimately what generates these sort of emotional sort of whirlpools.
Yeah.
But you can't. But again, when you're in the emotion, that's hard to do.
Right.
It's virtually impossible. But the other one is doable, and again, it may or may not be easy depending upon how you're in it. We tend to be experts at and addicted to this kind of a subliminal nursing of the thing, of sort of rehearsing our story in our mind and getting more and more emotional about it, and then we continue with it. So we're good at actually feeding the whole thing, just not intentionally, of course, subliminally. We just do this. But again, being with it as a textual experience, as a substantial, the presence of a substance of experiential quality, will have a tendency to transcend being with it as an interpretation, as a narration, which will tend to diffuse it. or tend to move in that direction anyway.
That's my experience too. There's another aspect though for me is that and it's weird because of what you were saying earlier about interpretation, because in that just meeting the emotion and being with it textually, there's sometimes like almost another dream that presents itself, like an archetype or something that starts to unwind it.
Mm-hmm.
But at that point, it's kind of like what you said about how you don't take it seriously. You don't believe the dream that's presenting itself. You just take the dream as if it's just part of what's unwinding your stuckness.
Right.
So you can play with it. It's sort of like a magician in a way. You can sort of play with that and let it kind of unwind your, I don't know what you want to call those holding places in your energy system, but whatever that is, that in a sense keeps you from direct seeing.
Yeah, for sure. Because all of this is full of intelligence. It's full of meaningfulness. It's got many, many, many dimensions of nuance and implication. And so when you're with this experience, or any experience for that matter, you'll tend to be in a hurricane of implication that will just keep spinning off in mirrors and reflections and alternative, just like constant a bombardment of information. It's like going into a library to get a book, and you get the whole wing of all the books that are next to it also sort of thrown at you, because our experience is so intrinsically information dense. It's pregnant with meaningfulness and intelligence on every level, not just in terms of thought and interpretation, of course. And so exactly so. There will be all of this, continued generation of content, generation of implication, generation of sort of intelligence, or they call it meaningfulness. I mean, again, it's sort of hard to pin down what it is, and it can be more or less pinpointed, or it can be very amorphous and just sort of more general. I mean, it can be anything, of course. So, but again, this isn't the problem. This is part and parcel of what experience is. Experience is intrinsically infinite dimensional. I mean, this is actually the most powerful fact about experience that makes it so freeing, is that nothing is limited. When you're with anything, you're with this bombardment of everything else simultaneously. I mean, literally, and seeing that frees us from stuckness. It frees us from our one-dimensionality, which is what generates all the senses of all our storylines and our interpretations and our stuff, which gets us into so much trouble. In terms of feeling stuck, in terms of feeling reactive, in terms of feeling like an individual with problems and all these sorts of things. When we see the actuality of this vast fountain of intelligence that experience is constantly just radiating forth inclusively, partiality is just, you really have to work hard to generate it, because it doesn't actually exist. I mean, we have to insist on it. We have to really work hard to create limitation, to create finiteness and definability in the face of the actuality of our experience is completely undefinable. It's just like, it's an overload. Experience intrinsically is an overload, and that turns out to be wonderful. That's our best asset, because it blows our pathetic assertions, into absurdity. The fact that this is the way it is makes our versions of it and our storylines and our arguments just these pathetic, paltry, little whinings of immature children in the face of, So again, just simply noticing that fact will tend to undermine our own believability in our own stories that we will never-endingly come up with, because that's the nature of mind, is to spin off interpretations. But we don't have to believe them. We may not be able to stop doing it, but we don't have to lock onto them and then get all torqued up about it. Oh, look at that, it's quitting time. And then it just flew past. Well, good night, online people.